Hello, everyone. Hello. This is Danny Haiphong. You are tuning in to another Left Lens live stream a little bit earlier today because we have a special guest. He's been on the program before. And before I introduce him, I want to make sure that YouTube catches up to the stream. So now that you are all trickling in, be sure to like the video, like this to boost it on the algorithm, get more people into this stream to watch what will be a really good conversation. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're new. Be sure to hit that notifications bell, although a lot of people are telling me the notifications aren't coming to them. Either way, hit that notifications bell. And of course, please do subscribe to this channel, support this channel and the work that I do at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. That's how you sustain this work. All right. Good morning, everyone. Good evening to our guests. So we are having on Brian Berletic. He is the curator, the host of the New Atlas, a great channel on geopolitics. I'm just going to bring him on. We had you on, Brian, February 7th, I believe it was, early February, and a lot has happened since then. So it's good to have you back to talk about some of this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's kind of late here. I'm happy to do it. Just people bear with me. I'll try to make sense.
Well, appreciate you taking time out of your evening. I know it's late out there, out east. But let's get to it. Let's just start with Sri Lanka. You've been doing some good work on that. I know it's a difficult topic to research, to study. There's been a lot made about it. I think the most principal argument that I've heard out of the corporate media is that the unrest there, the deposing of the government, that the roots of it are China, right? China leveled a debt trap on Sri Lanka. And we haven't heard much about the real political character of the protest. And you've been doing some research on it. So let's just spend a few minutes, if you could, just talking about what's the myths and what's the reality from what you've been able to find out thus far.
Well, I've heard the Western media cite debt trap diplomacy by China for quite a while, actually, long before the protests started in Sri Lanka. And, just scratching a little bit under the surface, you will see that it's not that at all. If you, they have articles on DW, which is Western media, German state media. They've got the little graph there that shows that debt to China is only 10%. The rest of it is to the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, Japan, and also these bonds. And the bondholders are all Western financial institutions. So it's obviously not Chinese debt trap diplomacy. There's way more debt owed to many others, and it's mostly owed to Westerners. So this is what we see the West do all the time, this projection where they're actually the ones preying on Sri Lanka and other countries like it, and they're not giving them anything for this money. China at least is giving them physical, tangible infrastructure, and then they blame China because it's a good excuse. It helps distract people. It's also fitting in with their anti-China agenda, which I guess we'll also be talking quite a bit about later on. So that part is actually being reported by some in the Western media. DW, Nikkei, which is very pro-Western, they did an article about who these bondholders were. And then I started doing a little research into the protests themselves. And it's kind of a collection of different groups. Obviously, these are not spontaneous protests. Most protests aren't spontaneous. Even good protests that you might agree with, they're not spontaneous. There's always leadership and there's always money behind them, because people going out into the streets for long periods of time requires resources and logistics. It's just a fact. These protests, it looks like it's a combination of opposition parties opportunistically using this as an opportunity to try to get themselves into power. It's also these, like quote unquote youth groups. And if you look at the leadership of these youth groups, they're people involved in U.S. government-funded National Endowment for Democracy associated organizations. And it's the same story everywhere you look. As a matter of fact, that's how I'm able to find these groups so quickly, because I'm very familiar with them everywhere else, and they're uncreative. U.S. is very uncreative. They've got it's like almost the same acronym, except they changed the first letter because it's a different country. It's ridiculous. You could spot it. It's so easy to spot once you know how, and that's what's going on in Sri Lanka. So it's a combination of opposition parties and these U.S. funded opposition groups who may or may not be working together. It's hard to tell. Is you got to get very familiar with the political system, and like you were saying before the show, it's still kind of playing out. So there's a lot to keep track on, but people should keep their eyes open and their mind open, and not just jump to conclusions. That's for sure.
Yeah, I feel like with something like Sri Lanka, like a lot of, we could call it color revolutions, or just instances of what you could call like it's kind of like an ambiguous abstract unrest. We don't get to hear about, okay, what are the actual political demands? What is being fought for? What is being responded to? There's obviously, inflation, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka was horrific, but no coverage about the roots of that. What are the roots of this, Brian? Like, it seems pretty obvious what's going on in the world that makes inflation and economic crisis for a dependent country like Sri Lanka so problematic. But could you tell our viewers what's the roots of Sri Lanka's economic crisis?
Well, they had a very long and destructive civil war. I guess you could call it a civil war, but if you really look into it, obviously, again, rebel armies don't just pop out of nowhere. They don't just, make their own guns. So it was, if you dig into it, you'll see the U.S. was heavily involved in arming these militants. It was highly destructive. It set a lot back for Sri Lanka. And then once it was over, they were kind of on their way to recovery. But they're doing all of this business with the West, with these so-called development organizations, and what that really is, it's predatory lending. And so they were digging a hole in debt, and then COVID hit, and the travel restrictions really hurt the economy. There's a big component is tourism, and if nobody's traveling at all, there goes your tourist industry, and everyone linked to it are going to suffer. And the government doesn't have any savings or any way to compensate these people until things get back to normal, which was actually quite a while before that happened. So it's just one thing after the other. And that's why you look at a lot of other nations, they invest so much on being self-sufficient to try to avoid this, or they diversify their economy so that if one market gets hit, is not the end of their whole economy. Sri Lanka is suffering because multiple disadvantages. Plus, they're a former British colony, and most former British colonies are very divided societies, and they've got a lot of issues that persist even to this day. So it's a combination of factors, I think. And then, as you alluded to, the sanctions, the Western sanctions against Russia, a growing list of sanctions against China, all of this hits smaller countries like Sri Lanka pretty hard.
Yeah, it definitely has an isolating effect. And I'm sure you're familiar with, you mentioned diversifying the economy. Well, there's an example that the U.S. media harpoons on the port of Hambantota, this port that was built. Sri Lanka couldn't finance it on its own. The West wanted nothing to do with it. Canadian companies, they looked at this situation. They're like, no, we're not going to invest. Typical story of Western countries looking at poorer countries that are dependent on them and saying, no, we're not going to actually build anything for you. So China decided to engage in the project. And then Sri Lanka couldn't finance it. Sri Lanka was their debt. They had political, you mentioned the political crisis that happened there even before this past one. So Sri Lanka had to lease it to China. And what did China do? Did China say, oh, you have to pay us? No, everything that Sri Lanka was paying on that lease was going to foreign creditors, not Chinese creditors. It was going to Western financial institutions. So in effect, this whole idea of China debt trap diplomacy is so ridiculous, but you'll even hear it now when you have these intense sanctions on Russia that are creating just shockwaves, especially in Europe and the United States, which then creates shockwaves in those countries that are dependent on them, financially,
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea of China debt trap diplomacy, it's just another one of these things that they make up and they keep pushing it so often that people just take it for fact, and it's ridiculous. There's a high-speed rail network being built across Southeast Asia. The section through Thailand is already under construction, and we'll hear stories about that trap diplomacy here when Thailand is actually financing it themselves. It's not being financed by China, not to my knowledge. And so it just goes to show you they're just going to throw that in no matter what, because it's just about smearing. They know most people aren't going to look into it. And when it comes to China, people have a lot of prejudices to begin with that make them want to believe that. It's not hard to get them to go along with negative news about China. And so they do. It's very unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, let's get into now the Ukraine situation, because it's very related to, I mean, a lot of countries now are suffering. The entire world economy outside of, I mean, China is, I think, having a significant impact from this. They are affected by this, but maybe to a lesser degree than others. But we've seen since the last time we spoke, Russia decided it was time to conduct a special military operation to stabilize, to defend the Donetsk and Lugansk republics. And that has created a really dangerous situation. What is the state of this war now? Because now we're 5 months in, more than 5 months in. And it seems like a war without victory. The United States and NATO thumped their chests for months, pumping weapons, leveling these intense sanctions. And then the economic situations in all of these countries, the US and NATO countries, started to crumble. What is the state of the situation now? What is the reality of the special military operation Ukraine?
It's very obvious that, at least at face value, the West seems to have severely underestimated Russia on many levels. Their political resolve, their military capabilities, all of this. It seems that they really underestimated Russia, how far they would go and what they're able to do. Now we're hearing all kinds of conversations about how, we thought that the United States and its Western allies, like, these were military superpowers. And now we're seeing all of these vulnerabilities in their industrial base, where they're not really able to keep up with Russian military industrial capacity, which I think is interesting. And I see a lot of analysis by people who seem to be experts, and they're part of these think tanks that seem to be influential when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. And when you watch them from the beginning of this operation all the way up until now, and you see how they've completely gotten everything wrong over and over again, and they keep changing their story, and to the point where now, and we're even seeing this in the Western media, where they're starting to kind of admit that maybe Ukraine isn't doing as well as we thought they were. Maybe Russia's doing a little bit better than we thought they were. And what it looks like is that Russia is going to continue taking territory until Ukraine comes to the table and negotiates, or they're just going to keep taking territory until they have as much as they want. What I imagine that they would do would be to take the entire coast. So that means from Kherson in the south, take Nikolaev, take Odessa, and then what's left of Ukraine, what would be Western Ukraine, that would be landlocked, a perpetually failed state that the U.S. and the European Union would be responsible for. It would be when you really think about what they tried to do with Ukraine and how they tried to harm Russia through using Ukraine, the fact that it would boomerang around and hit them like this is kind of a sense of irony, I think.
Yeah. Let's talk about, because what you're saying is that Russia is going to continue to progress. within its goals, and even beyond. I mean, beyond its goals, really, this is about trying to force some kind of settlement, right? That will be beneficial to Russia and, of course, beneficial to the people of Eastern Ukraine. It seems like the United States and NATO has no interest in that, so that's why we've had weeks and weeks and weeks of continued war, or at least continued special military operation, if we were going to be more precise. Why is it that NATO has not? Because the United States and NATO, they present themselves. I mean, I just heard Ro Khanna, right? When he's talking about China, he literally said on CNN to Wolf Blitzer, he said it would be a disaster if China, retaliated or responded to a Pelosi trip, and we're going to get to that. But when he cited NATO as being the reason for that. They saw how NATO came together and responded to Russia with sanctions and with supporting Ukraine. But it seems like a quagmire. It seems like that, and you've been covering the military side of this, like what U.S. and NATO countries have, the NATO alliance has been sending to Ukraine, and how effective that has been. Could you talk about that part of it? Like, why is it that Ukraine is struggling so much despite getting infused with tens of billions worth of both non-advanced and advanced weaponry, and seemingly having the protection of what is considered the most powerful military in the world, which is NATO countries, NATO, the most powerful military alliance. So what's going on here?
I mean, it's a combination of things. It's a combination of the West creating this myth of their own military invincibility. I think we've seen that kind of unravel over the course of the last 20 years regarding Iraq and Afghanistan, and also Syria. And the U.S. was trying to destroy Syria by proxy. Russia intervened, and they basically stopped it dead in its tracks. And they took back a significant amount of territory that was seized by these U.S.-backed militants. And now we're seeing kind of the same thing in Ukraine, but it's on a much larger scale. Russia is really committed to this. This is large-scale warfare. Another issue, and it might seem, very too straightforward, maybe. But Russia is a bigger country than Ukraine. They have a bigger military. Their military is better trained and better equipped. There were those 7 to 8 years where the U.S. and NATO were training thousands of Ukrainian troops, equipping them, arming them, pumping money into all kinds of military programs, training programs, military infrastructure. But 7 or 8 years, it sounds like kind of a long time. But for something like this, building up a formidable military, it does not happen overnight. It could take many more years to do that. Russia intervened in the middle of this ongoing war in Ukraine before this, before they could create a formidable military. Some people tried to say that it is a formidable military. They're pumping all of these additional weapons into Ukraine. They're saying that, oh, well, this is going to be a game changer. This is going to turn the tide of the conflict. But again, this kind of betrays the realities of warfare. You cannot just send a totally brand new weapon system to a country and they just go into battle and start using it. It's not an episode of G.I. Joe where, the guy jumps out of the airplane and into the tank and he knows how to drive all of them. In reality, it could take years to integrate a new weapon system. And just for an example, and I've used this example many times, the Bayraktar TB2 drone that Ukraine bought from Turkey, that was actually over a long period of time, several years, from the time they signed the contract, sent personnel to get trained, received all of the equipment, set it up, tested it, practiced with it, and then finally started using it in the Donbas region before this most recent conflict started. That happened over the course of several years. And if you think about that and then translate it to what the U.S. is trying to do, send HIMARS in just 2 or 3 weeks, or the M777s, And then there's all of these issues with logistics. These are all the nut and bolt details of a military conflict that so many people in the leadership in the West seem ignorant of. They don't understand this. And they're making decisions that run contra to these realities. And so the outcome is going to be more or less, it's going to be failure.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely. And why would they do it though? Because I think it could be easy the way the media, the Western media frames this war is Russia is waging a war, even though it's really a military operation, but it's not a full scale war. But they're saying it's a war without a cause. It's a war of kind of just Russia's aggression, and the United States and NATO are supporting Ukraine in order for them to kind of heroically beat back the Russian aggressor. But I think there's something else going on here, right? I mean, can you talk about the role of military contractors, the war profiteering? It seems like there's a lot of that going on here, especially given everything you've said about this failed strategy. This isn't a strategy to, get things done, get a settlement, bring about some kind of change on the ground. It seems like it's about keeping a permanent state of conflict there. So could you talk about the role of war profiteering?
Yeah, war profiteering obviously is a big factor in this. It's always going to be a factor in any conflict that the West wages. The ultimate irony is these gigantic military contractors, these weapon manufacturers, because profit is what drives them. There is no purpose except for profit. That ultimately ends up working against them. So they're fleecing their respective countries. All of these Western arms manufacturers, their customers are being fleeced. They get these overpriced systems that may or may not work as advertised. They may be comparable to Russian or Chinese weapons. They may be inferior to them, as we're seeing play out in Ukraine. The whole thing is they're doing this to maximize profit. They're not doing this to create the best defensive systems possible for the amount of money that they're getting. This is why Russia and China's system for arms procurement, I would say, works much better, and demonstrably so. But there's another thing too we have to think about. U.S. foreign policy stretches over decades. It doesn't matter who the president is. If you read documents from the end of World War II, what their vision was for the world, it was to stamp out any peer or near peer competitor. And obviously the two biggest were China and at that time the Soviet Union, but now the Russian Federation. And everything that the US has done has been in pursuit of encircling and containing both of them. It's the same process. They make it look like Russia and China are two separate issues. They're not. They're linked directly together. Over the decades, though, there's this window of opportunity that the U.S. had to assert itself, to establish global hegemony. The window is closing now, especially after the Cold War ended. The U.S. thought they had this big opportunity to knock out all the client states of the Soviet Union. That's what they considered them, the Soviet Union sphere of influence, and also encircle and contain China before it rose. And as we can see, they ran out of time. They're behind schedule on many things. The whole Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Iran, they're supposed to go into Iran. They're behind schedule on all of this. And the reason why is because when they drew up these plans at the end of World War II, they're thinking in 3 dimensions. They're not thinking in 4 dimensions. When it comes to technology, over time, technology improves exponentially, and it helps level the playing field. The U.S. assumed then, while making this plan, that they would have this edge indefinitely, that they would enjoy technological superiority over the rest of the world indefinitely. If you think about it, it's not unreasonable, because for generations, Western imperialism operated on this premise. But that changed, and you can see how Russia and China are leveraging technology to level the playing field and actually rise above it. And the whole concept of multipolarism is understanding that you're not going to be a hegemon, that just create a balance of power globally. The US is fighting desperately against this, even though it makes absolutely no sense.
Right, you can't avoid power. I mean, every country, movement, any time we're trying to influence politics, just anywhere, whether it's internationally or domestically, it involves power. You can't avoid that, but it doesn't have to be hegemony, and that's what multipolarity is all about. It can be we're distributing it amongst ourselves, we're working together, and we're coexisting in a way that can lead to a resolution of conflicts that are going to exist, and they're going to exist for probably quite some time, especially when you have, exactly as you stated, you have the United States and its so-called allies, NATO, etc., waging a kind of this two-front war with Russia and China. And you've been very consistent in covering both of these developments, the encirclement of Russia and the encirclement of China. And one thing that's quite clear is that there is a deficit in attention to one or the other. So oftentimes people will, especially people out here in the West, they'll focus on Russia and not China, or they'll defend Russia and they'll want to defend. There's a lot of splits that have occurred because of this, and in some part of this is falling into the propaganda. So what are we told? Because it's not a secret about Russia, right? You had Lloyd Austin say that the purpose of what the United States is doing in Ukraine is to weaken Russia. Then you had Joe Biden doing what Joe Biden does and says Putin cannot remain in power. So we know that the United States, even if it's subconscious, even if they don't want to say it out loud, many U.S. officials are looking at Ukraine as one part of a broader war to bring down the Russian government. And with China, it's similar, but even more delicate. Could you talk about like the why? Like, is it purely technology, or is there, because it seems like this move toward war with both of these countries is leading to very bad things for the United States and the West. It hasn't led to prosperity, it hasn't led to even more of a sense of superiority in reality, right? There's not, as you said, in those other wars, they were behind schedule. They weren't doing too hot against smaller countries like Syria, and now they're looking at Russia and China. So how come they can't stop this? Because we're going to get into Pelosi right after this. Because it seems like there's a really difficult challenge ahead of the warmongering psyche of the United States and its allies, where they can't seem to arrest this urge to wage this two-front war.
If you think about the whole system, the Western system, economically, perpetual growth, perpetual increasing profits, it's unsustainable. And so is the idea of empire. It's unsustainable. We've seen all throughout history empires rise and then fall. They overstretch themselves. They expend themselves into extinction, essentially. And this is what happened to the British Empire. And then the United States came in and they took over after all of these European empires. The Vietnam War, that was the U.S., but the West in general trying to reassert themselves. In Indochina, they took over these conflicts that the British made. The British were kicked out of their colonies in Southeast Asia. The U.S. took over by backing, and with British assistance, the British still do this hand in hand with the U.S., backing these opposition groups, these ethnic armed groups in places like Myanmar, and they were doing it in Indonesia and Malaysia. They continued doing this with the hope that they could reassert Western hegemony over all of these areas. When you're talking about these institutions, the State Department, the National Endowment for Democracy, all of the money involved, the military-industrial complex, it gets a momentum all in of itself. In other words, they have this momentum. It's very hard to change direction. You just have way too many people with the wrong mentality pursuing hegemony to change it toward a course that's more sensible. And then you see what the result is. You have a bunch of people. It's just like a company that's about to go out of business. It's behind the times. It's overextended. They're way too deep in it, and they were only pursuing profit. They never thought about sustainability, and then they go out of business. They could be the most, like if I don't know how many people in the audience are American. I'm an American. I grew up in America. You had things like Sears and Kmart, and they were so big. These companies were everywhere, and now they're nowhere because they couldn't change with the times. And they couldn't change with the times because they had a momentum in and of themselves. And this is the same thing that's going on with Western imperialism. I honestly believe that.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like this parallel process of the economics, right, leading to kind of this dead end, this graveyard, and that inevitably leads to, especially when the military side is predicated upon this profiteering, inevitably leads to the same kind of dead ends politically and militarily. I mean, it's something I've been speaking about a lot. It's a difficult connection to make for many, though, because a lot of this takes kind of going beyond even just what the facts are, right? You have to make conclusions from these facts. And it's hard for a lot of people to do that when they're inundated with the propaganda, with this endless anti-China and anti-Russia propaganda happening at the same time. And it is difficult, I think, for many to make the time and the commitment to go after both, right? To address both. That is it's challenging, yes, but a wholly necessary. And why is it necessary? Well, you have things like what we're going to talk about now with our good friend Nancy, good friend of the show, Nancy Pelosi. I mean, this conversation, I mean, it's almost sickening to even have to have this conversation. There's been now for, I believe it's been almost a week, if not more than a week now, where there was a leak from some anonymous somebody who said Nancy Pelosi is going to Taiwan, and she's going to visit in August. And she did not deny it. She's like, yeah, but we don't have plans yet, but tentatively it's for August. And of course, this has caused a lot of conflict. There's, China has responded pretty strongly, saying, well, you're the third in command in the White House. This is an unprecedented violation of the One China policy, and we will do what is necessary to protect our sovereignty. Basically everything's on the table. We know you're going to come with a military aircraft. This isn't the first violation, but this would be the strongest kind of violation. The United States is divided on this. The Pentagon, Joe Biden say, well, we don't know much about this, but we're hoping she doesn't go. It's not the strongest kind of opposition, but surely there is opposition. Nancy Pelosi, she has absolutely no opposition. And her friend Ro Khanna in the same state representative, who's considered progressive and who's considered someone, who's for all these progressive things in the U.S., because his wife has all these defense contractor stocks. He's all in on this too, because of course Taiwan has been a boon for defense contractors, for these big monopolies. What's your reaction to this, Brian? Because to me, not only is it being undersold in terms of the threat, even by the establishment that says they're opposed to it, but it feels like there's a lot of whistling past the graveyard, that this is actually a big moment and we should be paying really big attention to the possibility of this happening, and that the scenarios that could develop out of this, the responses to this could be unprecedented historically and lead to, an incredible intensification of this conflict that the U.S. has been in this warmongering the U.S. has been leading toward China. What's your reaction to this move?
Well, first of all of these different reactions from across the U.S. political spectrum, a lot of that is theater. And there's no way that the White House doesn't know anything about it, or Nancy Pelosi is just doing this on her own. If you study the history of U.S.-Chinese relations or lack thereof, and the way the U.S. had tried it alongside European powers to colonize China, and how they've spent all of this time post-World War II trying to reassert themselves over China. They dreamed of turning China into their own personal factory. They thought in the 80s they could overthrow the government. They could do to China what they were doing to the Soviet Union. The exact same process. This is why I say it's related. They do the exact same process along the peripheries of both of these countries, Russia and China. All of these countries that are very close by, they subvert and try to turn them against China or Russia. The one China policy that the U.S. agreed to says that Taiwan is part of China. It's very unambiguous. When you really read it, it's very unambiguous. It's very clear that it's part of China. The U.S. understands that it's part of China. It's hard to make any argument otherwise. If you're saying you don't support Taiwan's independence, and if they're not independent, then what are they? Who are they dependent on? The People's Republic of China. So these are blatant provocations. And the U.S. has been doing this for decades. They've been provoking China over Taiwan for decades. They were doing the same thing in regards to Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang. This is part of going into a large country and trying to divide it against itself, create all of these fires everywhere they can to complicate China's rise or to stop it. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, is to stop it. This is one of the last footholds that the United States has, Taiwan. And because China has shut down U.S. interference in Hong Kong, they've stabilized Xinjiang. Tibet, I think, has been for quite a while. So this is the last place where they can foster separatism. And that's exactly what it is. It's the U.S. sponsoring separatism. They send weapons. They have U.S. troops actually in Taiwan, which is unbelievable. And now they're doing things like this. And it's all blatant provocations. And when you really think about it, Taiwan is thousands of miles away from U.S. shores. It's none of America's business. And yet they're right at the center of the entire. I mean, like, again, also think of Ukraine. Why is the U.S. the big major player across the table from Russia regarding Ukraine? They're on the other side of the Atlantic. When you really think about it, it's very obvious this is all imperialism. And when they try to make, this minutia about how Russia and China are different, we can support maybe what Russia is doing or understand it, but not China. It's ridiculous. It's all the exact same thing. It's the U.S. at the center of the provocations in both regards.
Yeah. And, you made a really good point about this is a historical phenomenon, that this isn't the first time the United States has violated the one China policy. I mean, the 1982 joint communique says something to the effect of the United States won't sell more arms to Taiwan than previous years, right? Than previously it had done, which means leading to what they call a final resolution, the end. Although it's broad language, and of course the United States passed that Taiwan Relations Act, which basically subverts all of it and says, oh, no, we're going to keep giving arms to Taiwan. But historically, I mean, Daniel Ellsberg came out. He was like, I'm going to violate the Espionage Act. I don't give a crap. And he recently, within the last couple of years, I believe this was just 2 years ago, said, look, I got documents. I have Pentagon documents that say that the United States was considering dropping nuclear weapons on China over the Taiwan Straits crisis, right? So this is historic. The United States has really used Taiwan as what I call like a launching pad over for its broader war on China. Now, I want to pull up something because I just found this. I just found this yesterday. A couple of days ago. I want to get your reactions to this. It's actually quite hilarious, but it's an example of how this isn't Nancy Pelosi's first time saber rattling with China. Like, not her first time. So there was an op-ed in I think it's now Washington Post owned, or the same parent company of the Post owns Foreign Policy, but it's a rag of the foreign policy establishment. And it's like, what does Nancy Pelosi think she's doing in Taiwan? A risky trip seems more about dramatic gestures than actual help. Written by a Taipei-based non-resident Mike Chinoy of some think tank. No, he's a fellow. Yeah, some think tank, U.S.-China Institute. So the first couple paragraphs are all we need to look at. Very short. And then he's going to talk about how Nancy Pelosi got him arrested in China. So in 1991, he was in China. He was CNN's China bureau chief. U.S. Representative Nancy Pelosi got me arrested, he said. On a trip to Beijing with a congressional delegation, one of her colleagues alerted me that Pelosi and 2 other congressmen were planning to slip away from their official escorts and visit Tiananmen Square. But I was not told what her plan was, with news cameras rolling. to hold up that her plan was, with news cameras rolling, to hold up a banner and lay flowers to commemorate students killed when the Chinese army, I'm going to say so-called, supposedly crushed pro-democracy demonstrators there 2 years earlier. After her gesture, Pelosi and 2 other members of Congress drove off, while furious Chinese police, unable to target a visiting foreign dignitary, roughly detained me and other reporters on the scene for several hours. It was my first experience with Pelosi's penchant for high-profile gestures designed to poke China's communist rulers in the eye, regardless of the consequences. So this isn't even Pelosi's first time. Nancy Pelosi will. I mean, this is part of something I was talking about, Brian, with in a past stream. I want to get your reaction to just all of this. There's something about having this incredible, like this arrogant, extremely tiny minority, like political oligarchy, beholden to the military industrial complex, to these tiny number of private corporations that she literally trades stocks in. She has stocks all over the place, selling stocks all over the place with all the big tech corporations. You know, Pelosi is so arrogant that she is willing to do things like this, right? To put other people in harm's way. I mean, these are nobodies. This was the CNN bureau chief, Beijing bureau chief, put him in harm's way just to make a political statement. I mean, this is, and now we see that who are Nancy Pelosi's friends on Taiwan, visiting Taiwan? Newt Gingrich and the most right-wing faction of the Republican Party. That's who Mike Pompeo is singing her praises. So, I mean, what's your reaction to this? I just thought it was hilarious that she's done this before in China around a very sensitive issue like the Tiananmen incident.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing around the Tiananmen incident, if you actually look at the truth, even what the U.S. State Department itself said in its own cables about what actually happened there versus what people are still being told to this day, you know, this massacre, when it was actually the mob backed by the U.S., killing police and soldiers. That's another story for another time. But it just goes to show you, this isn't about right and wrong. Nancy Pelosi isn't standing up to the evil Chinese government. It's about looking down on China, refusing absolutely to show them respect, just as another group of people, let alone the large, powerful, increasingly powerful country China is. And this is not going to end well. They have this idea in their minds, and it's absolutely rooted in racism, that they are superior, just inherently superior. They don't actually have to do anything to be better than China. And we can actually see that this is not working out well for them, but they're going to continue provoking the situation. They would like to provoke a conflict with China, just like they're provoking a proxy conflict with Russia. They have a plan as this window of opportunity closes to encircle and contain China before it irreversibly passes the U.S. They want to try to destroy the economy by triggering a conventional war with China out at sea, blocking their maritime trade routes. And Nancy Pelosi, I mean, she's just one of very many people with this mindset, this mentality, looking down on China, provoking China, insisting on spreading these narratives. It's hard to tell whether she actually believes it or not. Anyone that actually spends time, I mean, if you're going to go through the effort of provoking an incident, shouldn't you look into the details and make sure you got them right? If she even just looked at what the U.S. State Department itself said about that incident, she wouldn't. But, it just becomes a smokescreen that they can carry on with their racism and imperialism behind, because otherwise they would just have to come out and say, well, we're better and we're not going to bow to the Chinese. We don't care how powerful they are. We'll knock them down a peg. This is the mentality. I mean, if you ever talk to racist people with this mindset, it's funny because she's considered left somehow by some people, I guess.
Yeah.
But she's just as bad as any racist right winger that you will ever find and talk to on the issue.
Oh, totally. I see people in the chat. Let's get these likes up, everyone. Let's get everyone viewing what Brian is saying, because he is definitely dropping knowledge. So get those likes up, everyone. We're still about more than 100 away from how many viewers we got. So whoever's watching this, just go to the channel, go to the video, drop a like. But I mean, what you're saying is so true, And when Nancy Pelosi was asked about this at a recent presser, she her response was, "Oh yeah, I think the Pentagon is worried that our plane might get shot down." It's like, okay, well maybe, but she said it in this manner of, you know, I dare them to. And then you had Ro Khanna go on CNN and literally say, who are they? Who are they? Right? And gets to the racism part of this. Who are they? The Chinese Communist Party, to tell Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, where she can travel, to set her travel schedule, to make it reduce what is an incredibly, I mean, I don't even want to say sensitive. I feel like that doesn't give it justice. An incredibly momentous, important flashpoint of this broader new Cold War, this broader military encirclement of China, this broader war effort on the part of the United States, building up toward the unthinkable with China, and responding to what would be kind of like lighting the fuse to the dynamite, what Pelosi's thinking of doing. I mean, it's incredible, but it gets to this point that you've been making. It's just like, China is viewed as not deserving of any respect, no matter how beneficial relations have been for the United States, no matter how many times the U.S. and China have come to the table to try to normalize relations and actually, make a lot of progress on that end over the last half century. Doesn't matter. The United States has this, especially over the last decade, has this kind of full speed ahead approach with China, where it wants to contain, which is a nice word, I guess, for undermine and overthrow the government. I mean, that it wants to weaken China's government. It wants to destroy its system, and any kind of, it feels like any kind of provocation around Taiwan that Pelosi is thinking about could only lead to a much broader and a much deeper conflict. So I don't know. Anyway, back to you.
Well, what you were saying, I mean, containing China, it's a great way of saying control and dominate. And just think about what they're saying. I mean, this is official foreign policy of the U.S., the Biden administration. They said, China's not going to surpass the U.S. on my watch. I mean, he said that. Think about what that means. China has a population 4 or 5 times bigger than the U.S. They have the same amount of people as the U.S. plus over a billion extra. They have first-class infrastructure. If you've ever been to China and you see it with your own eyes, the U.S. cannot even come close to comparing. It's industrial base, unparalleled. They have access to natural resources, and they do this through trade, not by occupying countries and pilfering it like the U.S. is doing in Syria right now, for example. They also graduate millions of STEM graduates, millions more than the U.S. And STEM, if you don't know, is science, technology, engineering, math. These are all the fields that contribute directly to the economy, high-tech industry, things that give you economic but also military power. Why shouldn't China surpass the United States? If all people are equal, this is the mantra we hear from the US. If all people are equal, there's more people in China. They're working hard. They're well educated. Why can't they surpass the United States? And the reason why is because, and this is the truth, and a lot of people get angry with me saying this, is because they're not white. They're not white people. And so inherently white people in their minds have this position over everyone else. And it will be unthinkable, unacceptable for a non-white nation to surpass the West. That's what it essentially boils down to. And this comes from generations of imperialism. This has been going on. I mean, back in the day, the British Empire, they never even tried to hide it, that they thought of themselves as superior. Everyone else were barbarians, and they had to whip them into shape. And they're sitting on all of these resources, how undeserving they are of their own resources, and how it's the British role to go in there and relieve them of those and do something constructive that they weren't doing themselves. And I still hear people in the West make these arguments, like justifying the invasion of Middle Eastern countries. They're just sitting on the oil. They're not doing anything with it. We're going to do something more important with it. So it's our right. Might makes right. But might makes right isn't fun anymore when you're not the mightiest country. And this is the meltdown we see happening across the West on the left and the right. We see this meltdown because they're not the mightiest anymore. That they're seeing their power reaching its limit, and they see others pushing back. And it's not just Russia and China; it's many nations asserting themselves. And I mean, like I'm here in Thailand, and the way a lot of Westerners in government and just ordinary Westerners coming here, traveling here, living here, the way they just look down on people in their own country, and the way they can't do anything right unless they're doing it the way the West does it. That's just inherently racist. That's racist. They can't do it properly unless they're doing it the way you do it. I mean, what is that if not racist? I don't know.
It's so deeply ingrained. I mean, when I traveled to China, I traveled with many such fellow travelers stateside, and let's just say that it is a deep affliction because the way that people behaved, right? I mean, we had a situation where we went to Urumqi in Xinjiang, and it was sensitive at that time. The propaganda about the concentration camps was really high. This was right before the genocide accusations, right before, but it was still just nonstop propaganda. This was only a couple years out from what had been a pretty frequent occurrence of violence there, and so they're very suspicious of foreigners. It's not that there's not a burgeoning tourist industry. There is in Xinjiang, especially Urumqi. It's not that you can't go there. You can. But it's a more heightened security situation. And so the way that some of our fellow travelers behaved was it's just an example of how deeply ingrained this is. Like, you go to another place like China, you feel like you're superior, like you should own it. And that's kind of how U.S. foreign policy toward China is right now. Because one of the things I always say, because I wrote an article about high-speed rail and how these big tech companies, how these financiers, how really the entire American establishment views high-speed rail in China. They view it as a bad thing. And the reason they view it as a bad thing is because they can't own it. They can't take over that market. They go to China, and China says, sure, we'll do business with you around developing our high-speed rail system as long as you know that we're going to be the ones building it. We're also going to be the ones who have the majority of of any kind of revenue that's made from it. Like, it's a joint venture. It is not you dominating. It's not, you're not the one who's investing. You're not the one who's going to have a full access. And so that's what angers the United States so much. That's what the Pompeos, when they say, oh, we can't get, they're stealing our patents and our secrets. What they're really saying is, it's not fair that if we work with them, they are able to surpass us, and we can't do that here. It's not fair, because all this stuff about stealing ideas and technology transfer, that's just par for the course with business. I mean, I'm not a business guy, but I know that if you come to the table, two companies come to the table, they're going to negotiate terms on trade and on investment that are going to be beneficial for both of them. So China wants to build, you want to make money. That's the arrangement, and now it's sour grapes because the United States feels like it's being left behind, and it's all its own doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things there. When you're talking about people traveling to China, and I've seen this in Thailand, Westerners will come here and they just have the need to demonstrate that they're superior, and to visibly look down on this culture that is different than theirs. They just have this built-in desire to do it. And when you watch Western media, there's a lot of this facade or superficial tolerance that they promote. But you watch movies, there might not be racism against certain groups of people, but there's definitely racism that's openly permitted, encouraged against Asians, and especially China. And now we're seeing the same thing with Russia. And also what you were saying about doing business in China on China's terms, West, for them, this is unacceptable. And why is that unacceptable? You expect people to come to your country and do business with you on your terms. Why is it not the same when it's reversed? But again, it's this generations of superiority, of doing whatever they want anywhere they go. It's built into their institutions, their history, their culture, their way of thinking. They cannot live in a multipolar world. Something else you were saying about high-speed rail, why they look down on it. I think you're absolutely right. The West, they think their system is superior. They're incapable of learning from others. Nobody's system is superior or perfect. There's always things that you can learn. But what you were saying is they want these short-term maximum profits. They cannot think long-term. They cannot think of, well, if we build the high-speed rail, that might not be profitable, but it might create an environment where other businesses can become more profitable. They don't think that many steps ahead. It's always this short-term, instant gratification. This is, I think, is an aspect many Westerners even can agree that is kind of a problem in the West. The inability to be patient, to think bigger, to think a few steps ahead. Because when you look at China and high-speed rail and a lot of what they do with their infrastructure, and I saw this in Singapore as well, this long-term planning that is done, you don't see that in the West. Or if they're doing long-term planning, is for all the wrong reasons. It's to perpetuate this unsustainable, like a constant expansion, which you cannot do this way. Cannot.
Yeah, no, you have long-term planning for increasing military budgets and figuring out how to disperse of just trillions of dollars to for military adventurism, or you have long-term planning around how do you keep these incredibly unstable banks, these huge banks, these huge monopoly banks that are literally just looting people through interest rates and debt. And all sorts of other mechanisms. And how do we, in the long term, keep propping them up? That's kind of the long-term economic strategy of the United States. And what's so interesting, when I was reading and writing about this report from, I think it's called the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, or the I's, it might be the other way around with the I words, but nonetheless, it's just a bunch of Clinton kind of like it's like a bipartisan think tank, and it's all rooted in tech. And they're like, high-speed rail in China is bad because, and they mentioned the profitability issue, and they said this is how much it costs to do it. That is too costly. We could go in there and make it cheaper. We could go in there and make it less costly by, they won't say what, but inevitably what that would mean is to completely reduce the scale of these projects. They don't want to see it because it's an example of what you can do when you plan things, and you're not always thinking about how are we making a buck off of this high-speed rail. It's exactly as you said. High-speed rail has so many other benefits, economic and social, just so many benefits. If you have high-speed rail, you can just transform, right, the lives of so many people. You can build even if the high-speed rail isn't building revenue, certainly the faster speeds that you're able to get people and goods to other places will certainly make more and more revenue and profits for whatever businesses in the overall economy. So it doesn't make any sense. And it allows China also to do things like, we'll do a Belt and Road, and we'll also expand these projects and be able to connect ourselves to neighboring countries. And then the neighboring countries, we connect to even further out. We can get to Europe a lot faster. We can go to Ethiopia, build a rail, and they can get to Djibouti a lot faster, and everybody wins. We win. We get good, we get what we want in trade arrangements a lot faster. They get what they want in the trade arrangements a lot faster. Like, it seems basic, but to, of course, those who are only interested in making very fast money, very fast profits as soon as possible for themselves, not for the good of the society, it's quite obvious why China would just bring about this deep fear into the hearts of these forces, and of course the governments that they ultimately control.
Yeah, and another factor why we might be seeing these type of policy decisions across the West is if you look at the background of Western politicians, they're career politicians where the only thing they've ever done in life is politics, or they're lawyers or they're academics and they've never actually done anything in the real world. They don't understand how things in the real world work. They don't understand fully how where all of these products come from, where these resources are coming from. They don't understand how, like you were saying, how high-speed rail or any infrastructure is connected to the larger economy. They can't visualize all that in their head because that's not their background. That's not their expertise. And if you look at politicians in China usually have a technical background in engineering and science. And so they understand how the physical world works. They understand how to organize things to make the best use out of everything. And it's not to say that profit is bad, but everything should be purpose driven. And of course, purpose driven enterprise will make profit, or it'll help the bigger picture. It'll help profit everybody. Prosperity for everyone. Have you ever met someone who's so selfish, constantly selfish, that they're actually creating their own problems? Like they do these things every day, very short-sighted things every single day to satisfy themselves, but in the long term, they're making their lives miserable because nobody wants to be around them. And I think that's a good analogy to use for the current leadership of the West. It didn't always be like, there used to be people who had these bigger ideas and could see the whole picture and could see how you needed this in order to get that. But it just seems like they're not capable of that. They're too busy with this project of containing Russia and China. They're so busy with the details that they haven't really thought of why they're doing it in the first place. Like if you really think about, we're going to contain this small country, America is going to contain this massive country, China. They're not really thinking about it. They should think about it out loud and say, why is this a country with 300 million people trying to contain a country with 1.4 billion people? Why are we doing that? What is the ultimate reason why we think we can do that? And then the rest will fall into place. I think people will see it clearly.
And the consequences are not seen clearly too, because it's like, if you do think about it a little harder, then the consequences are much easier to digest. I mean, this whole, with what's happened with Russia and the blowback from the sanctions to the Western economies, U.S. economy, that's not new. The trade war on China has been extremely damaging to the United States economy. It just doesn't get talked about that much. Got talked about a little when Trump was in office, but it gets talked about zero now. But it still hurts businesses from the United States. The Wall Street Journal had to published a letter of like 20 different industrialists and business executives saying, Biden, come on, cool it, guy. Like we're suffering here. Like this trade war is hurting our business. The politicization of everything is hurting our ability to continue to have any kind of engagement with China. Like you're putting our investments at risk, and that's what has happened. And that you have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is basically an all-out ban on goods from Xinjiang, imports from Xinjiang, which is also bad for inflation because a lot of important things are produced in Xinjiang. Cotton, there's a lot of cotton that comes out of there, which means everything that cotton is used for, prices will go up if you can't get it, if you can't get as much of it. Polysilicon for all this talk about climate change, but polysilicon is what you need to make any kind of renewable energy products, especially solar, the solar industry. So it's just, it's just a constant, like it's like these consequences don't matter because the political project, the military project has superseded even, and this is the scary part that people should be really, we're talking about a world system led by the United States, which is driven by profits, private, accumulating maximal profits for the fewest amount of people. You have a system like that is putting this military project in command. Everything else is secondary. just consequences, externalities. Oopsies, we're in a massive inflation and going toward economic crisis because of the special military operation. Do we, with Taiwan and Pelosi? I mean, I think that's an oopsies that nobody wants to see. I think that would be, I don't know if you agree with me, Brian, but that would be a degree much higher even than how the United States responded to Russia.
Well, I keep warning people that the U.S. is determined to stop China's rise, just like they were determined to, divide Europe and Russia, sabotage the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and trigger a proxy war with Russia through Ukraine. They were so determined to do this, they would stop at nothing to do it, and then finally they got it. They got what they wanted, and they're going to do the same thing with China. What people need to understand is that when was the last time a non-white nation rose to prominence and was the largest, strongest, most powerful nation on earth? Think of a time in history when that was the case. Think about how long ago that was, and think about the people who are in charge now in the West, their mentality, the way they look at things. What would they do to prevent that from happening, especially on their watch? Think about it. It's scary because, just like you were saying, they're making decisions that are irrational, that are hurting themselves because they refuse to allow China to surpass them. They refuse to allow all of these other nations to slip out from under the shadow, the darkness of Western hegemony that they've been under for generations. They refuse. It was just like with the Vietnam War. I mean, look at the price that the U.S. had to pay, and also the people in Vietnam, what they had to pay because of that stubbornness. They don't want to respect the self-determination of the Vietnamese people. And so we're at this point right now where when the window closes, it's not going to open again. And so we're seeing real desperation set in. We see it in regards to Russia, as Russia looks like they're prevailing on the battlefield in Ukraine. We see a certain sense of desperation set in there. And China's continued rise, patient, persistent rise. We see the desperation setting in across the West, this inability to accept that, and the increasingly desperate measures they're taking to try to reverse it. It's scary. It really is, because they're not thinking rationally. They're not even thinking in their own long-term best interests at this point.
Well, I want this will be the last question before we start to close it. I want to ask you two similar things. One, you've been studying the military situation with respect to Russia and Ukraine. Should the United States overstep? Ro Khanna claims that the United States is just so superior and China would be making this huge mistake. What would be the economic and military consequences? That's one question. Military consequences for overstepping here with Taiwan. Like, what would those be? Because it seems to me they're enormous, and there's just so many. So I don't know if you've been thinking about this, but do you have any that you have been thinking about and would like to share?
I think the United States is trying to provoke China specifically because they know China does not want to. They do not want to have to resort to a military solution. Time is on China's side. All they have to do is wait for the clock to run out. That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. That's what a lot of countries are doing. They're waiting for the clock to run out. They're being patient with the United States. I'm in Thailand. The relationship between Thailand and China has been growing and growing for years and years. A lot of people have these Cold War, they believe these Cold War myths about Thailand, its relationship to the United States. It's not that way anymore. And what a lot of these countries are doing is they're just kind of going along with it. And they're suffering all kinds of indignity because of how the U.S. is trying to provoke them so that the U.S. can do something rash and get the advantage now before it's too late. I really think that China will be smart about what it does in reaction to this, because they know ultimately time is on their side. The best way to achieve victory is for China to just surpass the U.S., not give it what it wants, which is a war or some kind of limited military conflict, while the U.S. still has a powerful military that, we're not really sure what will happen when China and the United States fight, if they fight. We don't know what will happen. And I think it's best if we don't find out. And I would like to see China be patient, and they know the situation better than any of us do. There's a lot of things that they see that we don't see. There's a lot of ways they can retaliate without necessarily resorting to military action. We see Russia do a lot of things like that. Even now, there's a lot of things that they could do that they're not, like shutting the gas off to Europe entirely. They could do that, but they're not doing that because they want to save. It's like you've got these cards in your hand. You want to save them in case you really need them. So it's hard to predict these things. I don't want to predict it. I just hope that China needs to understand, and I think that they do, that the United States is never going to respect them the way the leadership and the society is set up now. That will never happen. I've talked to people who honestly believe the U.S. respects their country, or wants it to be allies or something, and it just isn't so. It isn't, and you see evidence of this every single day. They need to understand that, and they need to prepare for it, but they need to be smart about it. They need to understand that the U.S. is running out of time, and to understand the nature of their desperation to navigate these next couple of years, because I think it's going to be very dangerous.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, no, I mean, biding time has been, one of the strategies of like hiding your capacity, hiding your capabilities, and bide your time, because that's what it's been with Taiwan. I mean, you're right. The whole strategy with Taiwan has been, we want peace for unification. Just know that we will defend our sovereignty if we are forced to, and here are the stipulations. And unfortunately, what Pelosi is doing is bringing us to a situation where they may feel forced to. And surely, I think whatever they would do would be smart. It would be very calculated. It wouldn't be just some kind of, out and out retaliative attack. The whole Pelosi saying, "Oh, worried about shooting down our planes." That wouldn't happen. China would make a very smart move. Even the foreign ministry continues to say, we're going to react quickly, and all of the consequences will be bore on their side. And so, and so they've done this before. They've banned officials from the mainland. They've cut their, whatever business ties they had in the mainland. They've been able to cut those. I think Pompeo's on a list of a few people who've had that happen to them because of their egregious violations. So, but the United States is playing with fire here, very much so, because while people like Rokan and Pelosi may think, oh well, look at we can try to cripple an economy just like we try to cripple Russia's. Didn't work in Russia, and it will not work in China. It will not work with China. The consequences will be bore primarily on the U.S. side, and I don't think Pelosi in these the military, the Biden, I don't think they take that seriously. I don't think they care. I don't think they care at all.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this the whole process of trying to contain China it's just taken a life of its own, and you just look at the narratives that are coming out of this. I mean, it just gets more and more bizarre and dangerous, and they don't. I mean, like if you look at the people running the U.S. right now, they don't care about where the U.S. is going to be 5, 10, 20 years from now. They don't care about the American people. They don't see themselves connected to it. And to them, the United States and the American people are just another group of subjects underneath them. And so it gets really dangerous because everything is disposable to them. But I think at least one thing that might be good coming out of this whole situation with Ukraine is that they're starting to understand the limits of their power. And then they should start thinking about how this translates into picking a fight with China. It's not the first time the U.S. has actually challenged China militarily. I mean, the Korean War, that was a totally different time. And look at the complications the U.S. military had fighting against Chinese troops, and just it's not going to work out well for them. The best thing, and what I always say, and this is my hope, is that this is going to burn out. These people running things right now, they're going to be history. Someone else is going to come in, and hopefully they are people who can find a constructive role for America among other nations, rather than trying to impose themselves on all other nations. You really think about it. America has a lot that it could offer the world, as long as it can understand that we're not number one. And are we a rational society? Look at the numbers. We should not be. Why should we be number one? What is special about us? And it's that simple. But they can't draw this conclusion, and that should scare everybody. That they can't draw this basic, simple conclusion, and they're so driven by a sense of superiority that they're willing to risk war. And they've been provoking China through, not just through Taiwan, but through many ways. Taiwan is probably the worst. But China has not reacted to it. So we just hope that China continues being smarter. And as they rise, and they can show the world a different model of having and wielding power.
Totally. Yeah, that's what's been happening. That's what has made, I think, this historical moment hopeful in a sense, because we do have that example. We do have that happening. And also, as you said earlier too, much earlier in the stream, it's not just China and Russia. Russia, they have a lot of friends. This is what we've learned too. China and Russia are not isolated. I mean, China, the idea of China being isolated, the most ridiculous. I mean, I just being in China or knowing anything about China, having a very cursory knowledge of China. Come on, China being isolated, that's just absolutely ridiculous. But the countries that are aligned with China, it was actually increasingly, Europe was increasingly building a really robust economic relationship before this new Cold War nonsense. But the world, a lot of the global South, Africa, most of Asia, Latin America, they're on board. China and Russia are their reliable friends, and that's not changing. And so we do have reasons to hope. We didn't even get into, though, Brian, that a lot of this elections, the U.S. is an election cycle. It feels like, given that Pelosi seems to be very keen on Newt Gingrich and Mike Pompeo's friendship, that there could be political reasons behind this. Any reactions to that before we close up here?
Well, I honestly, and maybe this is a weak point of my own, but I don't really put that much weight into American politics. I think it's mostly theater. I think people on the left and the right, they're all answering to the same handful of special interests, and a lot of it is for public consumption. You have to understand that empire works by dividing and distracting, and that is what American politics does best. When it comes down to certain issues, you see the facade of left and right evaporate instantly. They're all on board for Ukraine. They're all on board just provoking China over anything, and then including Taiwan. And I don't think elections are going to factor in at all, except they're thinking of how to use it to manipulate Americans and push all of this down the road another 2 to 4 years or 8 years, whatever
Definitely.
election you're talking about.
And use anti-China policies, use gestures, dramatic gestures like this to show, hey, we're tough on China, right? Because that's a political point now for the U.S. and the rest of the West, right? Look at what's happening in the U.K. with the prime minister fiasco. It's like it's all about tough on China. Who can be tougher on China? And the same with Russia. So in any event, Brian, this was a really good conversation. I know that you are now censored on Twitter. You've also come on a blacklist. Do you want to talk about that? And then just where people can find you. But I'll pull it up as you're talking about that a little bit.
Okay, so I think this is not the first time, but Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, actually, let me see if I can find what the exact, or it's some organization they made up recently. Anyway, I'm on this list with all of these other people. They're quite, a lot of them are quite prominent. I don't see myself as prominent at all. This is part of, let's see, does it say what? The Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation. And so I'm someone who is promoting Russian propaganda, but anyone who is familiar with my updates on the situation in Ukraine, they'll know all of my sources are Pentagon briefings or the Institute for the Study of War or literally the Facebook page of the Ukrainian General Staff. I mean, those are my sources. And I'm just pointing out how things that they say contradict other things that they say or just contradict reality versus basic facts you can look up and like the specifications of the HIMARS versus Russia's Tornado S, MLRS. You could look these things up yourself. So how's that Russian propaganda? And, it's just pointing out reality. Reality's inconvenient to Ukraine and its Western sponsors. And so they're using this as an excuse to do more censorship. I've already been censored off of Twitter and Facebook. I think it's just a matter of time before I'm off of YouTube. So what I always tell people is if you go to my YouTube channel, look in the video description, you will see the link to my Telegram. You will see the link to my Odyssey and Rumble channels. All of my videos on YouTube get automatically uploaded in a day or two to these other platforms. And if I ever disappear off of YouTube, that's where I'll be. I'll be at Rumble and Odyssey. And I'm trying to find the time to actually start doing exclusive videos for Rumble where I can say things and not worried about getting censored for it. Yeah. There's a lot of issues like about pharmaceutical industry and things like that you can't talk about on YouTube or they'll delete you. So you can go from getting 80% of the truth out to getting 0% of the truth out. So we'll just keep working on it, doing what we can do. I have a lot of people support me through Patreon, and I think you too, Danny, you have Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, but you got to be careful because they could cut you off from that also. So we have to be constantly thinking a few steps ahead, what we're going to do so that we can continue doing this work because it's important because people are not going to get this information elsewhere, not in the West. You see how hard they're trying to work to censor everybody and control the narrative.
Totally. I'm dropping your Telegram in the chat. Everyone should follow that. Also, you all should definitely come onto my Telegram as well. You get updates about all of the work that I'm doing because, yeah, it's real. I'm on the same boat. I need to find the time to get onto those other platforms as well with you, Brian, the Rumbles, Rockfin, those kind of things. It's important. I'm backed up on Odyssey, but we do need to we need to be backed up everywhere. We need to be producing on all places where at any moment, we say the wrong thing or they just pick up on one of the things we've been saying for a really long time. And it's, you could be off. I know I'm on my last strike on Twitter. You're off of Twitter. I know that the next time there's a successful report, and I get several of these per month, successful report, I'll probably be off of Twitter as well. So make sure that you are all following the alternative sources of information that we are, these platforms that we're using to spread our information. But nonetheless, Brian, thanks for coming. Everyone who's here, do like this stream, like this video before you go. We're going to end here. Actually, let me get off this screen. Like this video before you go. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. And yes, please do support the channel at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. That's how you keep this work sustainable. I'm looking for about 4 subscribers by the end of the month to get me to 500. Greatly appreciated. That would be very helpful and appreciate everyone that is subscribing already. All right, everyone. This was great. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll be back soon. Bye-bye.